The dusty rises of Kunjik, lying along the banks of the Tigris opposite today's Mosul, concealed treasures that would one day reshape how humanity understood its oldest stories. In the cold winter of 1849, the British explorer Austen Henry Layard drove his pickaxe into something far firmer than earth or rubble. What he struck was the corner of a ruined wall, part of what would prove to be the palace of the mighty Assyrian king Sennacherib. At first, he and his companions could hardly grasp the weight of their discovery. Yet in those months to come, as chamber after chamber came into view, they were unknowingly uncovering a legacy that would change the world's sense of its literary beginnings. The work was exhausting. With the help of local laborers, Layard pressed on in conditions that demanded both patience and resolve. Winter rains softened the ground, turning the site into heavy mud, while occasional floods from the nearby river threatened to wash away progress. Still, these cold months were kinder than the blazing Mesopotamian summers, when unbearable heat would have driven men from the dig. Slowly, carefully, they removed centuries of packed debris. What emerged stunned even the seasoned archaeologists. Scattered across the palace were thousands of clay tablets, many broken, many blackened by fire, yet all marked with the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform writing, a script that scholars of the time were only just beginning to decipher. By 1850 and into the following years, the magnitude of the find grew undeniable. Layard's gifted assistant, Hormuzd Rassam, who would later lead important excavations himself, realized they were not looking at random deposits of clay but at an ordered, deliberate archive. The fragments, painstakingly gathered and sorted, belonged to what would come to be known as the Great Library of Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king of the 7th century BC. This library represented one of humanity's first grand attempts to capture and preserve the full breadth of knowledge: state records, sacred hymns, ritual instructions, mathematical texts, medical writings, and works of literature. Rescuing the tablets demanded a delicate touch. Some had been scorched during the violent destruction of the palace, a catastrophe that ironically hardened them into greater permanence. Others had been cracked by the weight of stone collapsing from above or by the slow crush of centuries of earth. Each tablet required careful cleaning, cataloging, and protection before being crated for the long journey to London. By the time Layard ended his excavations at Nineveh in 1851, he had gathered around 30,000 tablets and fragments, an archive so immense it seemed impossible to grasp at once. It was nothing less than the preserved memory of Mesopotamian civilization across thousands of years. Yet among all these tablets, there was one collection destined to seize the imagination of the world. At first, the significance remained buried in fragments, undeciphered. It would take 2 decades before the story revealed itself. In the British Museum, George Smith, a man of modest beginnings but extraordinary talent, spent years studying the pieces. He was no typical scholar. Trained as a banknote engraver, Smith had developed a sharp eye for the smallest of details, and this skill proved invaluable as he traced the worn impressions of cuneiform signs. On a December day in 1872, Smith stumbled across a text that made him stop in wonder. It told of a catastrophic flood, of a righteous man who built a great boat to preserve his family and animals, and of birds released to find land as the waters receded. The resemblance to the biblical account of Noah was unmistakable, but the clay in his hands carried a story centuries older. Overcome, Smith reportedly leapt from his desk and began tearing at his clothes in excitement, unable to contain his astonishment. Whether or not this dramatic account is exaggerated, the impact of his discovery was real. He had uncovered part of what would later be known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically the 11th tablet containing the tale of Utnapishtim and the Great Deluge. With that moment, it became clear that the roots of many familiar traditions ran deeper than anyone had suspected, back into the cradle of Mesopotamia. The civilization that first gave voice to Gilgamesh had already been remarkable in its time. In the early dynastic period, around 2900 to 2300 BC, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers witnessed the birth of true cities. Among them, Uruk, the city most intimately bound to Gilgamesh's name, stood as a marvel of ancient urban life. Archaeological evidence suggests that at its height, Uruk may have housed as many as 50,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities on Earth. To modern eyes, these settlements would have seemed strange and imposing. Encircling Uruk were immense mud brick walls, 30 feet high and just as thick, fortified with towers and gates. Within lay a dense web of narrow streets, houses pressed close together, bustling markets, and workshops filled with craftsmen. Rising above it all was the city's ziggurat, a stepped temple of mud brick, layered tier upon tier, visible from far across the plains. These monumental structures, though requiring constant repair in the unforgiving climate, stood as symbols of both divine devotion and civic power. Life in such cities was highly ordered. At the summit of society stood the Lugal, the king, who wielded both military might and religious authority. Beneath him were priests and nobles, then merchants, artisans, and farmers. At the base were slaves, many of them prisoners of war or debtors. This rigid hierarchy is echoed in the epic itself, which never ceases to emphasize Gilgamesh's semi-divine birth and exalted rank. The lifeblood of Mesopotamian civilization was agriculture. The fertile alluvial soil between the rivers produced rich harvests of barley and wheat, but only if controlled by sophisticated irrigation systems. Canals, dikes, and reservoirs were constantly maintained to regulate the waters, for the same rivers that nourished could just as easily destroy through floods or drought. Unsurprisingly, the epic makes frequent reference to water, as sustenance, as danger, as symbol of divine will. Religion shaped every aspect of Mesopotamian life. Their world was alive with gods: Anu, Lord of the Heavens; Enlil, Master of Wind and Storm; Enki, Bringer of Wisdom and Fresh Water. Each city boasted its own patron deity. In the stories of Gilgamesh, this divine presence is constant, whether as allies, adversaries, or guides to mortal heroes. By the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BC, the tales of Gilgamesh were already being gathered and reshaped. What had once been separate Sumerian poems, about battles with rival kings, journeys to distant forests, encounters with gods and monsters, were beginning to coalesce into longer narratives. This was the age of Hammurabi, who forged Babylon into an empire and created one of history's first legal codes. In this environment of growing literacy, scribal schools attached to temples and palaces trained young men to copy texts, including the Gilgamesh stories. These scribes were not merely transcribers. They interpreted, edited, and combined. Generation after generation, they expanded and connected the stories, weaving them into more complex forms. Eventually, in the 7th century BC, a scholar priest named Sinlekianini would shape the standard Babylonian version. His name, preserved in colophons, scribal notes at the ends of tablets, tells us little beyond his role. But his work was extraordinary. He gathered the disparate strands and bound them into a single epic of 11 tablets, with a 12th added later. This version crafted a deliberate arc. The opening tablet presented Gilgamesh and his city. The middle tablets followed his adventures with the wild man Enkidu, their battles and quests. The later ones confronted the grief of Enkidu's death and Gilgamesh's desperate search for immortality. What emerged was more than myth. It was a meditation on life, death, friendship, and the limits of human ambition. The artistry of the epic was striking. Its lines employed parallel phrasing, repeating ideas with subtle variations, a hallmark of oral poetry that gave rhythm and aided memory. The imagery was rich, layered with metaphors of nature, divinity, and kingship. It was a work of literary sophistication that would influence not only Mesopotamia but the wider ancient Near East. Indeed, the echoes of Gilgamesh ripple far. The flood narrative directly shaped biblical tradition. The theme of a hero seeking eternal life would appear in Greek tales and Roman epics. The pairing of opposites, the civilized ruler and the untamed man, set a pattern repeated countless times in literature. The tension between human will and divine decree became a core question of religious thought. Even the celebration of friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu carved out a literary archetype enduring for millennia. That the epic survived at all is a testament to its value. Copies of it have been found not only in Mesopotamia but also in distant lands, from the Hittite capital of Hattusa to cities of Syria, evidence that it was regarded as essential knowledge across cultures. And when its fragments were rediscovered in the 19th century, the effect on modern scholarship was profound. No longer could one claim that civilization began with the Greeks and Romans. Here was proof of sophisticated literature, thousands of years older, grappling with the same eternal questions. Yet with its rediscovery came another question. Who was Gilgamesh? Could there have been a real king behind the legend? Scholars turned to the Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BC from earlier traditions. This document, inscribed on multiple tablets, sought to record rulers from the dawn of kingship. Among its entries is Gilgamesh, fifth king of Uruk's first dynasty, son of Lugalbanda and the goddess Nin's son, said to have reigned for 126 years around 2700 BC. The claim of divine ancestry may have been symbolic, yet it fits the Mesopotamian habit of exalting their great kings. The king list places his reign in an age when the city-states of southern Mesopotamia were consolidating power, defining borders, and building institutions that would shape later history. While its chronology may be exaggerated, those impossibly long reigns raising doubts, the underlying memory appears genuine. Archaeology has increasingly confirmed the existence of many rulers named in the list. Its value lies not in precision, but in preserving a sequence of memory stretching back into the mists of myth. At Uruk itself, excavations have revealed a city of staggering scale for its time. Situated near today's Warqa in southern Iraq, about 300 kilometers from Baghdad, it has been explored continuously since the late 19th century. Layer upon layer tells of human presence across 4 millennia. The most remarkable feature tied to Gilgamesh is the colossal wall system, 9 kilometers in length, 30 feet high, and reinforced with towers. Built of mud brick and bitumen, it required the labor of thousands and the planning of master builders. Archaeologists date this wall to the early dynastic period, the very era linked to Gilgamesh in the king list. Such a project suggests a ruler capable of mobilizing vast resources, a king of extraordinary authority. The walls were not just defensive, they were monuments of pride, declarations of power, visible across the plain. Within them, Uruk stretched across 600 hectares, home to as many as 50,000 souls. Managing such a population required careful urban design, systems for water supply, waste disposal, storage of food. Districts were organized for residence, craftwork, administration, and worship. Towering temples dedicated to Anu and Inanna dominated the sacred precincts. Cylinder seals, bronze tools, delicate ceramics, and imported gems tell of wealth and artistry, of trade stretching as far as Afghanistan for lapis and Lebanon for cedar. In this world, the real Gilgamesh lived and ruled. His reign, remembered in myth, was already being transformed into legend even as his memory persisted in the records. Victories in war became battles with monsters. Walls built by human effort became marvels of divine strength. Political marriages became liaisons with goddesses. His mortal death gave birth to stories of an eternal quest for life. The king who raised Uruk's walls and temples likely did lead armies, expand territory, and command massive building projects. Archaeological traces of destruction and rebuilding across Mesopotamia attest to warfare in his age, and Uruk's rise suggests success in uniting or subduing rivals. Temples like the Anu Ziggurat and the Precinct of Inanna, built in his time, point to organizational genius and religious devotion. Agriculture flourished in the irrigated fields, sustaining his people and funding his works. Trade flowed along long-distance routes, binding Uruk to the wider world. As high priest as well as king, Gilgamesh would have presided over rituals to Anu and Inanna, uniting spiritual authority with political power. The temples controlled land and wealth, and their partnership with the throne kept society balanced. When he died, likely around 2650 BC, he left behind a city transformed into a dominant power. But he also left behind a memory that, through centuries of retelling, would become the greatest story of the ancient world. From the moment of his death, the figure of Gilgamesh began to shift from the memory of a mighty ruler into the realm of myth. Oral traditions, passed from one generation to the next, shaped his image into something greater than history alone could contain. Victories became exaggerated into superhuman feats, and the memory of his reign fused with the gods and mysteries that framed Mesopotamian life. As centuries passed, stories of Gilgamesh traveled from the spoken word to written clay, ensuring that the king who once lived would never fade. The earliest written accounts, dating to around 2100 BC, already show this transformation well underway. Sumerian poems such as Gilgamesh and Aga of Kish, Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, and the Death of Gilgamesh depict him not only as a warrior and builder, but also as a man drawn into realms beyond human experience. These stories emerged roughly 6 centuries after his likely reign, long enough for fact to mingle freely with imagination. What survived was no longer merely a chronicle of deeds, but the birth of a legendary cycle. This process was neither unique nor accidental. Across cultures, extraordinary leaders became larger-than-life figures in memory. Where other societies spoke of Hercules, King Arthur, or Achilles, Mesopotamia had Gilgamesh. Over time, his exploits grew more wondrous. A victory over a rival city became a cosmic struggle against monstrous foes. The raising of Uruk's walls became an act of divine inspiration. His natural strength and cleverness swelled into semi-divine powers. His very parentage was lifted beyond the ordinary, making him the son of a mortal king and a goddess mother. The stories also reveal the deep values of the society that nurtured them. In Gilgamesh's conflicts with other kings, audiences could hear echoes of the endless rivalries between Mesopotamian city-states. In his journeys to distant forests or his confrontations with heavenly beings, they could see dramatized their own relationship with the natural and divine worlds. Through Gilgamesh, Mesopotamia told its people who they were, what they revered, and what limits even the greatest must face. The central theme of mortality grew steadily more pronounced as the tradition evolved. While early stories celebrated his strength and kingship, later versions focused on the inescapable fact that even Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, could not conquer death. This shift mirrored the concerns of generations who lived with constant reminders of life's fragility, floods, famine, disease, and war. The epic, in its fullest form, became not just a tale of glory, but a meditation on what it means to be human. Archaeological evidence supports the image of Gilgamesh as a powerful military leader. Excavations throughout southern Mesopotamia reveal settlements repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt during the early dynastic era. Such patterns of ruin suggest ongoing conflict, and Uruk's dominance in this period implies that its ruler, very possibly Gilgamesh himself, was instrumental in extending the city's influence. His works extended far beyond warfare. The Great Wall of Uruk, temples, and infrastructure uncovered by archaeologists all hint at a ruler of exceptional vision, capable of organizing immense projects and marshaling the labor of thousands. Economically, Uruk thrived on fertile farmlands nourished by irrigation, producing surplus grain that supported its population and funded its monumental works. Craft workshops produced fine ceramics, metalwork, and decorated seals. Trade routes stretched outward like threads from a web. Lapis lazuli arrived from Afghanistan, cedar from the Levant, and metals from Anatolia. Such connections not only enriched Uruk materially but also culturally, weaving it into a network of exchange that reached across the ancient world. Religiously, Gilgamesh was not simply king but also priest. He was the representative of the gods on earth, particularly of Anu, the sky god, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war. The temples of Uruk were centers of both faith and power, controlling land, wealth, and ritual. To rule was to serve the gods, and Gilgamesh's legitimacy depended on his sacred role. In life, he wielded that power. In memory, he became inseparable from the divine. As centuries rolled on, the stories of Gilgamesh grew ever richer. By the Old Babylonian period, scribes were already shaping them into extended narratives. Each generation added details, inserted new adventures, or reframed old ones. The figure of Enkidu, for instance, appears first as an opponent but later as a companion, his friendship with Gilgamesh forming the emotional heart of the tale. Together they journey to the cedar forest, confront the monstrous Humbaba, and slay the bull of heaven. Yet Enkidu's eventual death, decreed by the gods, shatters Gilgamesh and drives him on his desperate quest for immortality. It is this grief, and the search it provokes, that transforms the epic into something timeless. In wandering through distant lands, crossing seas, and meeting Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the Great Flood, Gilgamesh confronts the futility of resisting fate. No wall, no battle, no feat of strength can ward off death. What endures, the epic insists, are the works one leaves behind and the memory carried in the hearts of others. As centuries rolled on, the stories of Gilgamesh grew ever richer. By the Old Babylonian period, scribes were already shaping them into extended narratives. Each generation added details, inserted new adventures, or reframed old ones. The figure of Enkidu, for instance, appears first as an opponent but later as a companion, his friendship with Gilgamesh forming the emotional heart of the tale. Together they journey to the cedar forest, confront the monstrous Humbaba, and slay the bull of heaven. Yet Enkidu's eventual death, decreed by the gods, shatters Gilgamesh and drives him on his desperate quest for immortality. It is this grief, and the search it provokes, that transforms the epic into something timeless. In wandering through distant lands, crossing seas, and meeting Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the Great Flood, Gilgamesh confronts the futility of resisting fate. No wall, no battle, no feat of strength can ward off death. What endures, the epic insists, are the works one leaves behind and the memory carried in the hearts of others. Despite centuries of political upheaval and cultural change, the essential facts of Gilgamesh's reign, his rule over Uruk, his building projects, his military successes remained embedded in the epic tradition. This historical foundation provided the narrative framework that allowed later poets to explore timeless themes while maintaining connection to a specific time and place. The archaeological evidence of Gilgamesh's impressive building projects and military conquests tells only part of the story that would eventually become the Epic of Gilgamesh. The historical record, while demonstrating his effectiveness as a ruler, remains silent about the human cost of his achievements. It was the epic tradition itself that preserved the darker aspects of his reign, transforming the memory of a successful but autocratic Bronze Age king into a profound meditation on the abuse of power and the divine response to tyranny. The standard Babylonian version of the epic opens not with celebration of Gilgamesh's accomplishments, but with a stark portrayal of despotic rule that had pushed the people of Uruk to the breaking point. The text describes a king who had transformed from protector to oppressor, using his divine heritage and royal prerogatives to justify increasingly brutal treatment of his subjects. This portrayal reflects a sophisticated understanding of how absolute power could corrupt even the most capable rulers, a theme that would resonate throughout ancient Near Eastern political thought. Gilgamesh's oppression manifested in multiple forms that systematically degraded the social fabric of Uruk. The epic describes how he appropriated the traditional rite of just praemonoctus, claiming sexual access to brides before their weddings could be consummated. This practice, while historically documented in various ancient societies, represented a fundamental violation of family structures and social bonds that held communities together. The king's assertion of this right demonstrated his complete disregard for the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives, transforming what should have been joyous occasions into sources of humiliation and rage. The sexual exploitation extended beyond new brides to encompass a broader pattern of predatory behavior toward the women of Uruk. The epic suggests that no woman, regardless of her social status or family connections, was safe from the king's desires. This systematic abuse created an atmosphere of fear and resentment that permeated every level of society. Fathers could not protect their daughters. Husbands could not defend their wives, and the traditional structures of family honor and protection crumbled under the weight of royal tyranny. The king's abuse of power extended into the economic sphere through his demands for excessive labor service. The massive construction projects that had made Uruk famous required enormous human resources, but Gilgamesh's approach to mobilizing these resources showed complete disregard for his subjects' welfare. The epic describes how he conscripted young men for building projects without regard for agricultural seasons or family obligations, disrupting the economic cycles that sustained urban life. Fields went unharvested while their owners labored on royal monuments, creating food shortages that affected the entire population. The military dimensions of Gilgamesh's tyranny were equally oppressive. While his conquests had expanded Uruk's territory and brought wealth to the city, they also demanded continuous military service from the male population. The king's appetite for warfare seemed insatiable, driving him to launch campaigns that served his personal glory rather than the city's genuine security needs. Young men were conscripted for these adventures with no consideration for their families' needs or their own survival, creating a demographic crisis. As casualties mounted and productive members of society were lost to unnecessary conflicts. The epic's portrayal of these abuses reflects a sophisticated understanding of how tyranny operates in practice. Gilgamesh's oppression was not random violence, but systematic exploitation that touched every aspect of his subjects' lives. He used his position to extract maximum benefit for himself while externalizing all costs onto the population. The divine parentage that should have made him a benevolent protector instead became justification for treating mortals as expendable resources for his personal satisfaction. The psychological impact of this oppression on Uruk's population was devastating. The epic describes a city where fear had replaced civic pride, where families lived in constant anxiety about their safety and future. The traditional bonds of loyalty between ruler and subjects had been severed, replaced by resentment and desperation. The people who had once celebrated their king's achievements now viewed him as an enemy whose very existence threatened their basic human dignity. The social consequences of Gilgamesh's tyranny extended beyond individual suffering to undermine the foundations of civilized society. The rule of law, essential for urban life, had been replaced by royal caprice. Justice became impossible when the king himself was the primary source of injustice. The economic systems that supported the city's prosperity began to break down as the population's energy was diverted from productive activities to serving the king's personal desires. The religious institutions that should have provided moral guidance found themselves compromised by their dependence on royal patronage. The people's response to this oppression followed patterns familiar from other instances of tyranny throughout history. Initially, they endured in silence, hoping that the king's behavior would moderate or that natural forces would intervene. However, as the abuse continued and intensified, their desperation drove them to seek supernatural assistance. The epic's portrayal of their prayers to the gods represents more than simple religious devotion. It reflects the complete breakdown of earthly remedies for their suffering. The prayers directed to Anu, the supreme god of the Mesopotamian pantheon, carried particular significance. As the divine king of the gods, Anu was considered the ultimate source of legitimate authority on earth. The people's appeal to him represented a formal challenge to Gilgamesh's legitimacy, arguing that his behavior had violated the divine mandate that justified royal rule. This theological dimension of their complaint transformed their suffering from mere political grievance into a cosmic crisis requiring divine intervention. The parallel prayers to Uruk, the goddess of creation, reflected a different but equally profound understanding of the crisis. Uruk had been responsible for creating humanity itself, and the people's appeal to her emphasized how Gilgamesh's tyranny threatened the very essence of human dignity and social order. Their prayers requested not merely relief from oppression but active intervention to restore the balance between ruler and rule that made civilized life possible. The epic's description of these prayers reveals the sophisticated theological thinking that had developed in Mesopotamian religion by the time of the standard Babylonian version. The people understood that divine intervention would not come automatically, but required proper ritual approach and compelling justification. Their prayers emphasized not personal grievances, but the broader threat that Gilgamesh's behavior posed to the divine order itself. They argued that allowing such tyranny to continue would undermine the gods' own authority and the cosmic principles they represented. The divine response to these prayers demonstrates the epic's complex understanding of how supernatural forces interact with human affairs. The gods did not simply punish Gilgamesh for his crimes, but instead chose to address the underlying problem through creative intervention. Their decision to create Enkidu represented a sophisticated solution that would transform the tyrant king rather than simply destroying him, reflecting the epic's ultimate concern with redemption and growth rather than mere retribution. Uruk's role in creating Enkidu carried deep symbolic significance that connected to broader themes in Mesopotamian mythology. As the goddess who had originally shaped humanity from clay, her decision to create a new being specifically to counter Gilgamesh's excesses represented a kind of divine correction to her earlier work. The epic suggests that the gods recognized their own responsibility for the crisis since Gilgamesh's divine parentage had contributed to his sense of superiority over ordinary mortals. The process of Enkidu's creation, as described in the epic, involved careful consideration of what qualities would be needed to match and redirect Gilgamesh's excessive energies. Uruk designed him to be equal in strength and courage to the king, but fundamentally different in character and values. Where Gilgamesh represented the pinnacle of civilized achievement corrupted by power, Enkidu would embody natural virtue uncorrupted by social hierarchy or political ambition. The epic's portrayal of divine intervention reflects sophisticated thinking about the relationship between supernatural forces and human political systems. God's response to the people's prayers was not arbitrary, but followed logical principles that respected both divine authority and human dignity. They chose to work through natural means, rather than miraculous intervention, creating a being who would operate within the normal parameters of human existence while possessing the extraordinary qualities needed to challenge Gilgamesh effectively. The theological implications of this divine response extended beyond the immediate crisis in Uruk to address fundamental questions about the nature of legitimate authority. The epic suggests that rulers derive their power from divine sanction but remain accountable to both gods and subjects for how they exercise that power. When a king violates this sacred trust, the gods themselves will intervene to restore proper order, not necessarily through punishment, but through transformation and education. The creation of Enkidu also represented a sophisticated solution to the problem of absolute power itself. Rather than simply removing Gilgamesh from the throne, which would have created political chaos, the gods chose to provide him with an equal who could serve as both companion and constraint. This approach recognized that Gilgamesh's exceptional abilities were not inherently evil, but had been misdirected by isolation and unchecked power. The introduction of a true peer into his life would force him to confront the consequences of his actions and develop the empathy necessary for just rule. The epic's treatment of these themes reveals the political sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian thought about governance and authority. The text demonstrates clear understanding that tyranny emerges not from inherent evil, but from the corruption of power by isolation and lack of accountability. The divine solution addresses these root causes rather than merely treating symptoms, suggesting that the epic's authors had observed the cyclical nature of political oppression and sought to identify sustainable remedies. The people's prayers and the divine response also illuminate the epic's understanding of collective action and social responsibility. The citizens of Uruk did not simply endure their oppression passively, but took active steps to address it through proper channels. Their appeal to the gods represented a form of political action that respected existing authority structures while seeking redress for legitimate grievances. This approach reflected the sophisticated political culture that had developed in Mesopotamian city-states where citizens understood both their obligations to legitimate authority and their rights to protection from abuse. The divine solution to Gilgamesh's tyranny required a being of extraordinary nature, one who could match the king's superhuman strength, while embodying the natural virtues that civilization had corrupted in him. Uruk, the goddess of creation who had first shaped humanity from the primordial clay, accepted the challenge presented by the desperate prayers of Uruk's oppressed citizens. Her task was not merely to create another human being, but to fashion a counterpart who could serve as both mirror and antithesis to the tyrant king. Working with the same fundamental materials she had used to create the first humans, Uruk gathered clay from the wilderness steppes far beyond the walls of any city. This clay, untouched by human hands and uncontaminated by the corruptions of civilized life, would form the physical substance of her new creation. The goddess moistened the earth with water from wild springs, sources that had never been channeled through human irrigation systems or contained within artificial reservoirs. Every element of Enkidu's creation emphasized his connection to the natural world and his separation from the urban environment that had produced Gilgamesh's moral corruption. The process of shaping Enkidu required divine artistry of the highest order. Uruk molded not just a human form but a being who would embody the strength and nobility of the animal kingdom while retaining the essential spark of human consciousness. His body emerged from her hands with the muscular development of a man who had never known ease or comfort, every sinew hardened by constant physical exertion. In the harsh wilderness environment, his frame was massive and powerful, built on a scale that matched Gilgamesh's own divine heritage, but achieved through natural development rather than supernatural endowment. The goddess endowed Enkidu with physical capabilities that would allow him to survive and thrive in the most challenging natural environments. The senses were heightened beyond normal human capacity, allowing him to track animals across vast distances, detect the approach of predators, and navigate by subtle environmental cues invisible to civilized humans. His reflexes operated with the lightning speed necessary for survival among wild beasts, while his endurance surpassed even that of the nomadic peoples who lived on the margins of settled society. Enkidu's appearance reflected his wild origins in every detail. His hair grew long and thick, forming a man-like covering that protected him from the harsh sun and cold nights of the open steppes. Unlike the carefully groomed beards of civilized men, his facial hair grew wild and untamed, giving him a fierce aspect that commanded respect from both animals and any humans who might encounter him. His skin was darkened and toughened by constant exposure to the elements, bearing the scars and calluses that marked a life of continuous physical challenge. The clothing that Uruk provided for her creation consisted entirely of animal skins, but these were not the carefully prepared and decorated garments worn by hunters and herders. Instead, Enkidu wore the raw pelts of animals that had died natural deaths, roughly fashioned into coverings that provided protection, without compromising his connection to the animal world. These primitive garments allowed him to move silently through the wilderness and to approach wild creatures without triggering their instinctive fear of human predators. Enkidu's initial existence in the wilderness represented a perfect harmony between human intelligence and natural instinct. Unlike the first humans who had been created for life in gardens and cities, he was specifically designed for survival in the untamed world beyond civilization's borders. His knowledge came not from formal education or cultural transmission, but from direct observation and intuitive understanding of natural patterns and relationships. He could read the subtle signs that indicated changing weather, locate water sources in seemingly barren landscapes, and predict the movements of animal herds across seasonal migration routes. The relationship between Enkidu and the wild animals of the steppes transcended the normal boundaries between human and beast. Rather than viewing animals as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be overcome, he understood them as fellow inhabitants of a shared world deserving of respect and protection. The presence among animal herds caused no alarm or disruption, as they recognized in him a kindred spirit who posed no threat to their welfare. Gazelles would graze peacefully in his vicinity, but cattle would allow him to approach their calves, and even predators like lions and wolves accepted his presence without hostility. This extraordinary relationship with the animal kingdom was based on mutual understanding and benefit rather than domination. Enkidu served as a protector and guardian for the creatures of the wilderness, using his human intelligence to shield them from the various dangers that threatened their survival. When drought struck the steppes, he would guide herds to hidden water sources that only he knew how to find. During harsh winters, he would lead animals to sheltered valleys where they could find protection from storms and adequate forage to survive until spring. The most significant aspect of Enkidu's protective role involved his interference with human hunting activities. The wilderness areas where he lived were regularly visited by hunters from various settlements who sought to capture animals for food, hides, and other valuable materials. These hunting expeditions, while necessary for human survival, often involved methods that Enkidu found cruel and wasteful. Hunters would set snares and traps that caused prolonged suffering to their victims, or they would kill more animals than they could use, leaving carcasses to rot while taking only the most valuable parts. Enkidu's response to these hunting activities demonstrated both his intelligence and his commitment to protecting his animal companions. He would systematically locate and destroy trap lines, freeing animals that had been caught and dismantling the devices before they could claim new victims. His knowledge of animal behavior allowed him to warn herds of approaching hunters, causing them to change their routes or seek shelter in areas where human pursuit would be impossible. Hunters attempted to drive animals into confined areas for mass slaughter. Enkidu would create diversions that allowed the intended victims to escape. The physical methods Enkidu employed to protect animals from hunters required both strength and stealth. He could move through the wilderness with complete silence, approaching trap lines without alerting their creators or any guards they might have posted. His powerful hands could break apart even the most sophisticated snares and pitfalls. His knowledge of animal psychology allowed him to calm frightened creatures and guide them to safety. When direct confrontation with hunters became necessary, his imposing physical presence and obvious strength usually convinced them to abandon their efforts without violence. The impact of Enkidu's interference on local hunting communities was significant and growing. Hunters who had previously relied on certain territories for their livelihood found their success rates declining dramatically as their traps were repeatedly destroyed and their prey disappeared. The economic consequences affected not only the hunters themselves, but also the communities that depended on their activities for food and trade goods. Families that had traditionally supported themselves through hunting and trapping found their income sources threatened by this mysterious figure, who seemed to appear wherever they attempted to work. The hunters' initial response to these mysterious interventions was confusion and frustration. They could find no explanation for the systematic destruction of their equipment or the sudden weariness of animals that had previously been easy prey. Some attributed the phenomena to hostile spirits or malevolent supernatural forces, while others suspected sabotage by rival hunting groups seeking to monopolize the best territories. The discovery of human footprints at the sites of destroyed traps only deepened the mystery, as no known person possessed the skills necessary to move so silently through the wilderness or to approach wild animals without causing alarm. As reports of the mysterious wilderness guardians spread among hunting communities, various theories emerged about his identity and motivations. Some hunters believed they were dealing with a hermit or exile who had somehow learned to survive in the wild and had developed an irrational attachment to the animals he lived among. Others suggested that he might be a member of some unknown nomadic tribe with customs that prohibited the killing of certain animals. The most superstitious hunters convinced themselves that they faced a supernatural being, perhaps a forest spirit or transformed animal that had taken human form to protect its kind. The growing conflict between Enkidu and the hunting communities created a crisis that demanded resolution. The hunters' inability to pursue their traditional livelihood threatened the economic stability of entire settlements. While Enkidu's protective activities grew more bold and extensive, as he gained confidence in his abilities, the situation had reached a point where direct confrontation seemed inevitable. But the hunters' fear of this mysterious figure and their inability to locate him in the vast wilderness made any organized response extremely difficult. The physical environment where Enkidu lived and operated was harsh and unforgiving, testing even his extraordinary capabilities on a daily basis. The steppes stretched for hundreds of miles in all directions, broken only by occasional rocky outcroppings, seasonal streams, and scattered groves of hardy trees. During summer months, the temperature could reach levels that would kill ordinary humans, while winter brought bitter cold and driving winds that made survival a constant struggle. The landscape offered little natural shelter, forcing Enkidu to create his own refuse and caves, rock crevices, and dense thicket. Water sources in this environment were scarce and often unreliable, requiring intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns and hidden springs to ensure survival. Enkidu had memorized the locations of every permanent water source within hundreds of miles, as well as the seasonal streams and temporary pools that appeared only during certain weather conditions. His ability to find water in seemingly barren areas was crucial not only for his own survival, but also for his role as protector of the animal herds that depended on his guidance during drought periods. The food resources available in the wilderness were limited and required constant foraging to maintain adequate nutrition. Enkidu's diet consisted primarily of wild plants, fruits, nuts, and roots, supplemented by occasional consumption of animals that had died from natural causes. His knowledge of edible plants was encyclopedic, encompassing not only obvious food sources, but also the subtle seasonal variations that determined when different plants were safe to eat and when they might be toxic. This botanical expertise allowed him to maintain his health and strength despite the absence of cultivated foods or domestic animals. The social isolation of Enkidu's existence was profound and complete. Apart from his interactions with animals and his confrontations with hunters, he lived entirely alone without the companionship, conversation, or cultural stimulation that humans normally require for psychological health. His only communication was with the animals he protected, and while this relationship provided emotional satisfaction, it could not fulfill the deeper human need for intellectual and social connection. Shamit's invitation to visit Uruk represented a crucial turning point in Enkidu's existence. The decision to leave his wilderness home and enter human society was not made lightly, as it meant abandoning the animals he had protected and the environment where he'd found purpose and meaning. Poverty, growing isolation, and his desire to understand the human world that seemed so different from his own ultimately convinced him to accept the invitation. The journey to Uruk would expose him to experiences and challenges that would transform his understanding of both himself and the world around him. The transition from wilderness to civilization proved more difficult than Enkidu had anticipated. His first encounters with agricultural settlements revealed the extent of human modification of the natural environment. Fields of cultivated grain stretched across landscapes that had once supported wild plant communities. But irrigation canals channeled water resources that had previously flowed freely to support natural ecosystems. The systematic organization of human settlements, with their clearly defined boundaries and specialized functions, contrasted sharply with the organic patterns of wilderness life. Enkidu's physical appearance and behavior marked him as an outsider in every human community encountered during the journey. To Uruk, his wild hair and primitive clothing drew stares and whispers from settled peoples who had never seen anyone living in such a natural state. His unfamiliarity with basic social conventions created awkward situations that highlighted his complete separation from civilized life. Simple activities like eating prepared food or sleeping in enclosed spaces proved challenging for someone accustomed to the complete freedom of wilderness existence. The gradual process of Enkidu's introduction to human society involved learning not just practical skills but entire systems of meaning and value that govern civilized life. The concept of property ownership, fundamental to agricultural societies, was particularly difficult for him to understand. His wilderness experience had taught him that resources belonged to whoever needed the most at any given moment. While human society operated on principles of permanent ownership and exclusive control, these conflicting worldviews created tensions that would influence his later interactions with urban civilization. The social dynamics of human communities also presented challenges for Enkidu's integration. His direct communication style and lack of familiarity with social hierarchies led to misunderstandings and conflicts with people who expected more conventional behavior. His physical strength and imposing presence commanded respect, but his ignorance of cultural norms created situations where that respect was mixed with fear and suspicion. The journey to Uruk became a crash course in human social behavior that tested his adaptability and intelligence. As the traveling party approached Uruk, Enkidu's first glimpse of the great city provided a shocking introduction to the scale and complexity of human civilization. The massive walls that surrounded the urban core rose higher than any natural formation he had encountered in the wilderness, while the smoke from countless hearths and workshops created a haze that obscured the horizon. The sound of human activity, voices, tools, animals, and machinery created a constant background noise that contrasted sharply with the natural sounds of the steppes. The entry into Uruk itself overwhelmed Enkidu's senses with the intensity of urban life. The narrow streets teemed with people engaged in activities he'd never imagined. From craft production to commerce to religious ceremonies, the density of human population within the city walls exceeded anything he had thought possible, while the variety of occupations and social roles demonstrated the complexity of civilized society. The smells, sounds, and visual stimuli of urban life created a sensory overload that left him struggling to process the information flooding his consciousness. Enkidu's arrival in Uruk coincided with preparations for a royal wedding, event that would provide his first direct encounter with Gilgamesh's tyrannical behavior. The celebration was intended to be a joyous occasion marking the union of two prominent families, but the king's assertion of Gilgamesh had transformed it into a source of community tension and resentment. The bride's family faced the humiliation of seeing their daughter subjected to royal privilege before she could join her chosen husband, while the groom's family struggled with the insult to their honor and status. The wedding preparations revealed the systematic nature of Gilgamesh's oppression and its impact on Uruk's social fabric. What should have been a celebration involving the entire community had become a source of division and fear. Families with marriageable daughters lived in constant anxiety about when they might face similar demands, while young men wondered whether they would ever be able to establish normal family relationships. The king's behavior had corrupted one of society's most fundamental institutions, turning marriage from a source of joy and stability into an instrument of royal domination. Enkidu's reaction to learning about the Prima Noctis was immediate and visceral. His wilderness upbringing had taught him to protect the vulnerable and to oppose any form of unnecessary cruelty or exploitation. The idea that a ruler would use his power to violate the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives struck him as fundamentally wrong, contradicting every principle of natural justice he had learned during his years. Among the animals, his moral outrage was intensified by his growing understanding of how marriage functioned in human society and the damage that Gilgamesh's behavior was causing to community relationships. The specific wedding that brought Enkidu into direct conflict with Gilgamesh involved a young woman whose family had tried desperately to avoid the royal pension. They had attempted to conduct the ceremony quietly, hoping to complete the marriage before the king learned of their plans. However, Gilgamesh's network of informants had discovered their intentions, and royal guards had been dispatched to ensure that the king's privileges were respected. The confrontation that was building would pit Enkidu's natural sense of justice against the established power structure of Uruk. The wedding procession that Enkidu encountered was a study in contrast between public celebration and private anguish. The formal aspects of the ceremony proceeded according to ancient traditions with music, dancing, and ritual offerings that honored the gods and celebrated the union of two families. However, the underlying tension was palpable as everyone present understood that the evening would bring not consummation of the marriage, but royal violation of the bride. The forced smiles and hollow congratulations reflected a community going through the motions of celebration while experiencing collective trauma. Enkidu's decision to intervene in the wedding crisis was not impulsive, but reflected his fundamental character and values. His years of protecting animals from human predators had taught him to recognize exploitation and to act decisively against it. The situation in Uruk represented the same pattern on a larger scale with a powerful individual using his advantages to harm those who could not defend themselves. His moral framework, developed through direct experience of natural justice, left him no choice but to oppose Gilgamesh's tyrannical behavior. Confrontation began when Enkidu positioned himself in the path of the royal procession that was approaching the wedding site. His massive frame and wild appearance create an immediate sensation among the crowd, many of whom had never seen anyone like him. The royal guards, accustomed to dealing with ordinary citizens who offered no resistance to the king's demands, found themselves facing an opponent whose physical presence suggested capabilities far beyond normal human limits. The tension in the air was electric as two forces prepared to clash in the streets of Uruk. Gilgamesh's arrival at the scene created a moment of recognition that would define both characters for the rest of their lives. The king, expecting to find the usual cowering submission that greeted his appearances, instead encountered someone who showed no fear or deference. Enkidu's steady gaze and confident posture communicated a challenge that Gilgamesh had never faced before. For the first time in his reign, the king found himself confronting someone who appeared to be as equal in strength and who clearly intended to oppose his will. The initial exchange between the two giants was conducted without words, as each assessed the other's capabilities and intentions. Gilgamesh's divine heritage had given him confidence that no mortal could match his strength, while Enkidu's wilderness experience had taught him to evaluate threats accurately and respond appropriately. The crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation sensed that they were about to observe something unprecedented in the history of their city. The battle that erupted between Gilgamesh and Enkidu was unlike anything the citizens of Uruk had ever witnessed. Two beings of superhuman strength grappled in the narrow streets, their combat creating a spectacle that combined the raw power of natural forces with the skill and intelligence of exceptional warriors. The sound of their struggle echoed off the city walls while the ground trembled under the impact of their movements. Buildings shook as the combatants crashed into walls and doorways, their battle raging across multiple city blocks as neither could gain a decisive advantage. The techniques employed by each fighter reflected their different backgrounds and training. Gilgamesh fought with the refined skills of a warrior king, using holds and throws that had been perfected through years of military training and combat experience. His movement showed the discipline and precision of someone who had studied the arts of war under expert instruction. Enkidu, by contrast, relied on the raw power and instinctive reactions that had been developed through years of survival in the wilderness. His fighting style was less polished, but equally effective, combining human intelligence with the fierce determination of a wild animal defending its territory. The battle continued for hours, with neither combatant able to achieve victory over the other. Their strength proved to be perfectly matched, creating a stalemate that tested both their physical capabilities and their mental resolve. The crowd that had initially gathered to watch the spectacle gradually realized that they were witnessing something more than a simple fight. The equal struggle between the two giants suggested that Gilgamesh had finally met his match, a possibility that had seemed impossible given his previous dominance over all challengers. The exhaustion that finally ended the titanic struggle between Gilgamesh and Enkidu left both warriors sprawled in the dust of Uruk's central plaza, their bodies bearing the marks of combat that had lasted from dawn until sunset. Neither had achieved victory, but both had discovered something more valuable than triumph, the existence of an equal. As they lay gasping for breath, their eyes met with mutual recognition of strength and worth that transcended the conflict that had brought them together. The crowd that had witnessed their battle stood in stunned silence, understanding that they had observed a transformation that would alter the course of their city's history. The recovery period that followed their confrontation allowed both men to assess what they had learned about each other. Gilgamesh, accustomed to effortless dominance over all opponents, found himself genuinely impressed by Enkidu's raw power and fighting instincts. The wild man's techniques, while unrefined by civilized standards, had proven devastatingly effective against even the most skilled combat methods. More importantly, Enkidu's willingness to risk everything to protect the innocent had demonstrated a moral courage that the king had rarely encountered among his subjects. Enkidu, for his part, recognized in Gilgamesh a warrior whose abilities matched his own, but whose potential had been corrupted by isolation and unchecked power. The king's fighting skills revealed intelligence and discipline that commanded respect, while his obvious loneliness suggested a man who had been denied the companionship necessary for emotional and moral development. The wild man's years of protecting animals from human predators had taught him to distinguish between those who killed from necessity and those who caused suffering for pleasure. And he sensed that Gilgamesh belonged to neither category, but rather to a third group, those who had lost their way through circumstances beyond their control. The friendship that developed between the two warriors emerged gradually through shared experiences and mutual respect. Their initial conversations conducted while their wounds healed revealed the extent of their complementary natures. Gilgamesh possessed knowledge of history, politics, and culture that fascinated Enkidu, while the wild man's understanding of natural processes and animal behavior opened new perspectives. For the king, their discussions often lasted through the night, as each discovered in the other a mind capable of matching his own intellectual intensity. The transformation in Gilgamesh's behavior toward his subjects began almost immediately after his encounter with Enkidu. The presence of a true equal in his life provided the emotional anchor that had been missing since his childhood, when his divine heritage had begun to separate him from normal human relationships. The king's previous cruelty had stemmed not from inherent evil, but from the psychological damage caused by absolute power exercised in complete isolation. Enkidu's friendship offered him the first genuine human connection he had experienced since ascending to the throne, creating the foundation for moral growth and self-reflection. The citizens of Uruk observed these changes with cautious optimism, uncertain whether the king's apparent reformation would prove lasting or merely temporary. The cessation of the Jus Priminoctus was the most immediately visible sign of transformation as royal guards stopped appearing at wedding ceremonies and families could once again celebrate marriages without fear of royal interference. The excessive labor demands that had disrupted agricultural cycles were also reduced, allowing the population to return to normal patterns of work and rest that supported both individual welfare and community prosperity. However, the most significant change in Gilgamesh's character was his growing restlessness and desire for meaningful challenges. The satisfaction he'd previously derived from dominating his subjects had been replaced by a hunger for adventures that would test his abilities against worthy opponents. His friendship with Enkidu had awakened ambitions that extended beyond the boundaries of Uruk, creating dreams of achievements that would earn genuine glory rather than mere fear and submission. The idea of journeying to the cedar forest first emerged during one of their lengthy conversations about the nature of heroism and the proper use of exceptional abilities. Enkidu's stories of the wilderness had included references to distant mountains, where enormous trees grew in groves protected by supernatural guardians. These tales sparked Gilgamesh's imagination as he envisioned expeditions that would take them far from the familiar territories around Uruk into lands where their strength and courage would face genuine tests. The cedar forest, known to the people of Mesopotamia as a source of the precious timber essential for major construction projects, lay in the mountain ranges that would later be called the Lebanon Mountains. The cedars that grew there were unlike any trees found in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, reaching heights of over 100 feet and possessing wood of extraordinary durability and beauty. The resin-rich timber was prized for its resistance to decay and insects, making it the preferred material for temple construction, royal palaces, and the most important ceremonial objects. The economic value of cedarwood had made it a crucial trade commodity throughout the ancient Near East, but obtaining it required expeditions that few rulers were willing to undertake. The forest location in remote mountain valleys meant that transportation costs were enormous, while the difficult terrain and harsh climate made the journey dangerous even for well-equipped parties. More significantly, the forest was said to be protected by Humbaba, a monstrous guardian whose presence had discouraged most attempts at large-scale timber harvesting. Humbaba's reputation as a fearsome supernatural being had grown through generations of storytelling, but the core of these tales was based on genuine encounters with a creature of extraordinary power and malevolence. Descriptions of the monster varied in detail, but all agreed on his enormous size, his command of natural forces, and his absolute hostility toward human intruders. Some accounts portrayed him as a giant, with the head of a lion and the body of a man, while others described him as a creature of living fire whose breath could kill at a distance. The decision to mount an expedition against Humbaba represented more than simple adventure seeking for Gilgamesh and Enkidu. The king saw the mission as an opportunity to demonstrate that his reformed character had not diminished his courage or capabilities while also securing valuable resources for Uruk's continued prosperity. The cedar timber would enable construction projects that would benefit the entire population, transforming the expedition from a personal quest into a service to the community. For Enkidu, the journey offered a chance to test his wilderness skills in an environment more challenging than the familiar steppes, while also supporting his friend's desire to achieve something worthy of his abilities. The planning phase of the expedition required careful consideration of logistics, equipment, and personnel. The distance to the cedar forest meant that the party would need to carry supplies for several weeks of travel through terrain that offered limited opportunities for resupply. The mountainous environment would require specialized equipment for climbing and camping, while the anticipated confrontation with Humbaba demanded weapons and armor of the highest quality. The expedition would also need skilled guides familiar with the route and experienced porters capable of carrying the heavy loads necessary for such an ambitious undertaking. The weapon forging process that preceded the expedition represented one of the most significant metallurgical undertakings in Uruk's history. The city's master craftsmen working under direct royal supervision created arms and armor specifically designed for the challenges that Gilgamesh and Enkidu would face. The weapons needed to be not only exceptionally sharp and durable, but also capable of inflicting damage on a supernatural opponent whose nature remained largely unknown. The smiths experimented with new alloys and forging techniques, creating blades that combined the hardness necessary for cutting through tough materials with the flexibility required to withstand the stresses of extended combat. The axes that were forged for the expedition were massive two-handed weapons weighing nearly 200 pounds each, designed to take advantage of the warrior's superhuman strength. The blades were made from the finest bronze available, alloyed with tin imported from distant lands, and worked by smiths who had perfected their craft over decades of royal service. The handles were carved from the hardest wood available and reinforced with bronze fittings that would prevent breakage under the extreme stresses of combat. The finished weapons were works of art, as well as instruments of war, decorated with intricate patterns that honored the gods and proclaimed the bearer's royal status. The swords created for the expedition were equally impressive, featuring blades over 4 feet in length that could serve as both cutting and thrusting weapons. The metallurgy involved in creating such large blades required techniques that pushed the boundaries of Bronze Age technology with careful attention to heat treatment and tempering that would ensure the weapons would not shatter under combat stress. The hilts were designed to accommodate the warrior's large hands while providing the grip security necessary for extended fighting. Wrapped in leather that had been specially treated to prevent slipping even when wet with blood or perspiration, the armor crafted for Gilgamesh and Enkidu combined protection with mobility, recognizing that their fighting style depended on speed and agility rather than passive defense. The bronze scales were individually shaped and fitted to create flexible coverage that would turn aside most weapons while allowing full freedom of movement. The helmets were designed to protect the head and neck without restricting vision or hearing, featuring reinforced sections that could withstand heavy blows while maintaining the balance necessary for rapid movement in combat. The religious preparations for the expedition were as important as the physical ones, reflecting the Mesopotamian understanding that success in dangerous undertakings required divine support. The primary deity invoked for the mission was Shamash, the sun god whose domain included justice, law, and the protection of travelers. Shamash's blessing was considered essential for any expedition that would take the warriors beyond the familiar territories where their local gods held sway, as his solar authority extended across all lands touched by sunlight. The ritual ceremonies conducted to secure Shamash's blessing involved elaborate offerings and prayers that emphasize the expedition's noble purposes. The priest emphasized that the mission was not motivated by greed or conquest, but by the desire to serve the community and to test the warrior's abilities against a worthy opponent. The cedar wood that would be obtained from the forest would be used for temple construction and other projects that would honor the gods and benefit the people of Uruk. The defeat of Humbaba would remove a threat to future expeditions and open new opportunities for trade and exploration. The specific rituals performed for Shamish included the sacrifice of bulls and the offering of precious oils and incense that would carry the prayers to the gods' celestial realm. The ceremonies were conducted at dawn when Shamish's power was strongest and his attention was focused on the earthly realm. The priests recited ancient formulas that invoked the gods' protection against supernatural enemies and his guidance through unknown territories. The warriors themselves participated in purification rituals that would prepare them spiritually for the challenges ahead, including fasting and meditation that would focus their minds on the sacred nature of their mission. The departure from Uruk was marked by ceremonies that involved the entire population, as the citizens gathered to witness the beginning of an expedition that would test their reformed king and his wild companion. The procession that carried the warriors to the city gates included musicians, priests, and representatives of every craft guild, creating a celebration that honored both the expedition's goals and the courage of its participants. The weapons and armor were displayed prominently, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning sun and symbolizing the divine favor that the ceremonies had sought to secure. The route to the cedar forest led through territories that neither Gilgamesh nor Enkidu had previously explored, requiring careful navigation and constant vigilance against both natural hazards and human enemies. The first portion of the journey crossed the familiar agricultural lands surrounding Uruk, where irrigation canals and cultivated fields provided evidence of human control over the natural environment. However, as the expedition moved farther from the city, the landscape gradually became wilder and more challenging with rocky hills and sparse vegetation that tested both the warriors' endurance and their ability to find adequate supplies. The transition from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the foothills of the Lebanon mountains required adjustments in travel techniques and equipment use. The flat terrain that had allowed rapid movement on foot gave way to steep slopes and rocky paths that demanded careful attention to footing and balance. The climate also changed dramatically with the hot, dry conditions of the lands replaced by cooler temperatures and increased humidity that affected both the warriors' physical comfort and the condition of their equipment. The wildlife encountered during the journey was unlike anything either warrior had previously faced, including species that had adapted to the mountain environment and possessed capabilities that made them formidable opponents. Mountain lions, bears, and wolves posed constant threats to the expedition, while venomous snakes and insects created additional hazards that required constant vigilance. The hunting opportunities were also different from those available in the familiar territories around Uruk, with game animals that were more elusive and required different tracking techniques. The approach to the cedar forest itself was marked by increasingly ominous signs that suggested the presence of supernatural forces. The animal life became scarce and nervous, with birds and small mammals displaying behavior that indicated their fear of some unseen threat. The vegetation showed signs of damage that could not be explained by normal environmental factors, with trees bearing scorch marks and areas of ground that appear to have been burned by intense heat. The air itself seemed to carry a sense of menace that affected both warriors despite their courage and determination. The first sight of the cedar forest was both magnificent and terrifying, as the enormous trees stretched across mountain valleys in formations that seemed to defy natural growth patterns. The cedars themselves were larger than any trees the warriors had previously encountered, with trunks that would require dozens of men to encircle and branches that created a canopy so dense that little sunlight reached the forest floor. The silence within the forest was unnatural and oppressive, broken only by occasional sounds that seemed to come from no identifiable source. The search for Haber required careful exploration of the forest's most remote sections, where the guardian was said to make his dwelling. The warriors moved through the undergrowth with weapons ready, their senses alert for any sign of the monster's presence. The tracks they discovered were unlike anything in their experience, showing claw marks and footprints that indicated a creature of enormous size and power. The destruction visible in some areas suggested that Humbaba's rage could devastate entire sections of the forest when aroused. The confrontation with Humbaba began with the monster's roar, a sound that echoed through the mountains and seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The creature that emerged from the forest depths was even more terrifying than the legends had suggested, standing nearly 20 foot tall with features that combined human intelligence with bestial ferocity. His body was covered in scales that gleamed like bronze armor, while his eyes burned with an inner fire that seemed to penetrate the warriors' souls. His breath created clouds of superheated air that withered vegetation and made the surrounding atmosphere almost unbearable. The battle that followed tested every skill and technique that Gilgamesh and Enkidu had developed during their years of training and combat experience. Humbaba's size and strength exceeded even their superhuman capabilities, while his command of natural forces allowed him to call upon wind, fire, and earth as weapons against his opponents. The monster's claws could shred bronze armor as easily as cloth, while his breath could kill at distances that made conventional weapons ineffective. The warriors were forced to rely on speed, coordination, and tactical intelligence to compensate for their disadvantages in raw power. The turning point in the battle came when Enkidu managed to distract Humbaba long enough for Gilgamesh to deliver a crippling blow to the monster's legs, reducing his mobility and forcing him to fight from a defensive position. The creature's wounded roars brought avalanches cascading down the mountainsides, while his thrashing movements uprooted trees and carved new channels in the rocky ground. However, his reduced mobility allowed the warriors to coordinate their attacks more effectively, gradually wearing down his defenses through sustained assault. As defeat became inevitable, Humbaba's demeanor changed from fierce aggression to desperate pleading as he begged for mercy and offered to serve the warriors as a guardian of the forest under their authority. His appeals emphasized his role as a protector of the natural world and his willingness to share the forest resources with humans who approached with proper respect. The monster's pleas revealed an intelligence and emotional depth that complicated the warriors' understanding of their mission and raised questions about the morality of their actions. The decision to execute Hanba despite his pleas for mercy represented a crucial moral choice that would have lasting consequences for both warriors. Gilgamesh, influenced by his royal training and his desire to complete the mission successfully, argued for killing the monster to ensure that future expeditions would not face the same threat. Enkidu, whose wilderness experience had taught him to respect the natural order and to avoid unnecessary killing, initially favored sparing Humbaba's life in exchange for his cooperation. The debate between them revealed fundamental differences in their worldviews and their understanding of justice and necessity. The final blow that ended Humbaba's life was delivered jointly by both warriors, symbolizing their shared responsibility for the decision and its consequences. The monster's death was accompanied by supernatural phenomena that suggested the cosmic significance of their action, including earthquakes, storms, and the appearance of omens that would later be interpreted as warnings from the gods. The silence that followed Humbaba's death was profound and unsettling, as if the forest itself was mourning the loss of its guardian and contemplating the implications of human intrusion into the natural order. The aftermath of Humbaba's death left Gilgamesh and Enkidu standing in the eerie silence of the cedar forest, their weapons dripping with the monster's dark blood while supernatural winds howled through the ancient trees. The ground beneath their feet trembled with aftershocks that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the earth, as if the natural world itself was responding to the guardian's violent end. The cedar trees, which had stood for millennia under Humbaba's protection, now swayed ominously in the unnatural breeze, their massive branches creaking with sounds that resembled mournful laments. The two warriors began the arduous task of selecting and harvesting the finest cedar trees, their axes biting deep into wood that had never known human touch. Each stroke echoed through the mountain valleys with a resonance that seemed to carry far beyond the physical realm, announcing to gods and mortals alike that the ancient barrier between civilization and the primordial wilderness had been shattered. The cedarwood itself was unlike anything found in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. Its grain tight and resinous, filled with aromatic oils that would preserve it for centuries to come. The return journey to Uruk was triumphant, yet tinged with an undercurrent of unease that neither warrior could fully articulate. The precious cedar logs they transported would provide material for temples and palaces that would stand as monuments to their achievement. But the memory of Humbaba's final pleas continued to haunt their thoughts. The supernatural phenomena that had accompanied the monster's death had not ceased with their departure from the forest. As strange dreams and ominous portents followed them across the mountain passes and down into the familiar territories of home, the citizens of Uruk greeted their returning heroes with celebrations that lasted for days. As the successful completion of such a dangerous mission elevated both Gilgamesh and Enkidu to legendary status among their people, the cedarwood was immediately put to use in construction projects that would beautify the city and honor the gods, while craftsmen competed for the privilege of working with timber that had been won through such extraordinary courage and skill. The weapons and armor that had served them in battle against Humbaba were displayed in the royal palace as trophies of their victory, their bronze surfaces polished to mirror brightness that reflected the glory of their achievement. However, the divine realm had taken notice of the warriors' actions in the cedar forest, and the gods' response would prove far more complex and dangerous than either hero could have anticipated. The killing of Humbaba had disrupted the cosmic balance that governed the relationship between civilization and the natural world, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of their victory. The monster had not been merely a guardian of trees, but a crucial component in the divine order that regulated human expansion and maintained the boundaries between the mortal and supernatural realms. The news of Humbaba's death reached the goddess Ishtar as she observed the celebrations in Uruk from her celestial palace, her divine senses attuned to the shifting currents of power and influence that flowed through the mortal world. The sight of Gilgamesh at the height of his glory, his body bronzed by the mountain sun, and his frame enhanced by the confidence that came from overcoming seemingly impossible challenges, stirred desires within the goddess that transcended her usual interactions with mortal men. His transformation from Tyrant to hero had created a figure of such compelling attraction that even the Queen of Heaven found herself drawn to his presence. Ishtar's interest in Gilgamesh was not merely physical, but encompassed the political and cosmic implications of an alliance between the greatest goddess of Mesopotamia and the most successful king of his generation. Such a union would create a partnership that could reshape the balance of power between the divine and mortal realms, while also providing the goddess with a mortal champion whose achievements already rivaled those of legendary heroes. The timing seemed perfect, as Gilgamesh's recent victories had elevated him to a status that made him worthy of divine attention. But his friendship with Enkidu had demonstrated his capacity for loyalty and emotional depth. The goddess began her approach to Gilgamesh with careful calculation, appearing to him in dreams and visions that gradually intensified his awareness of her presence and interest. Her initial manifestations were subtle, taking the form of favorable omens and supernatural assistance that aided his daily activities as king. The harvests in Uruk's territories proved exceptionally abundant. Trade negotiations concluded with unusual success, and potential military threats dissolved without requiring armed intervention. These blessings were accompanied by increasingly vivid dreams in which Ishtar appeared in various forms, each more beautiful and alluring than the last. The goddess's physical appearance when she finally revealed herself to Gilgamesh was calculated to overwhelm his senses and cloud his judgment with desire. She manifested in her aspect as the goddess of love and beauty, her form radiating an otherworldly perfection that surpassed any mortal woman's attractiveness. Her skin possessed the luminous quality of polished ivory, while her hair fell in waves of deepest black that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. Her eyes held the depth of night skies, filled with stars, and her voice carried harmonics that resonated with frequencies beyond normal human hearing. The garments that adorned Ishtar's divine form were woven from materials that existed only in the celestial fabrics that shifted color and texture with her movements and seemed to be composed of captured starlight and crystallized moonbeams. Precious stones that had never been seen on Earth decorated her clothing and jewelry, their surfaces reflecting images of distant worlds and cosmic phenomena that spoke of her dominion over realms beyond mortal comprehension. The very air around her shimmered with power, creating an aura of supernatural authority that commanded both reverence and desire. Ishtar's proposition to Gilgamesh was delivered with the confidence of a goddess accustomed to having her desires fulfilled without question or hesitation. She offered him not merely her physical affections, but a partnership that would elevate him beyond the limitations of mortal existence, promising him dominion over territories that extended far beyond the boundaries of earthly kingdoms. Her words painted visions of cosmic adventures and supernatural achievements that would make his victory over Humbaba seem like a minor preliminary to greater glories that awaited their union. The gifts that Ishtar promised to bestow upon Gilgamesh reflected the vast scope of her divine powers and the resources at her disposal. She offered him a chariot, crafted from precious metals and gemstones that would carry him across the heavens as easily as earthly roads, drawn by creatures that combined the strength of lions with the speed of eagles. His palace would be expanded to rival the dwellings of the gods themselves, with rooms that opened onto gardens where every flower bloomed eternally and every tree bore fruit that granted extended youth to those who consumed it. The military advantages that would accompany their alliance were equally impressive, as Ishtar commanded legions of supernatural warriors who could ensure victory in any conflict that might arise, kings and princes from Distant lands would seek Gilgamesh's favor, bringing tribute and homage that would make Uruk the center of her empire, stretching from the sunrise to the sunset. The goddess's influence over fertility and abundance would ensure that his territories produced harvests that could feed vast populations while generating surplus wealth that would fund any project or ambition he might conceive. However, Gilgamesh's response to Ishtar's proposition revealed the wisdom and moral growth that had resulted from his friendship with Enkidu and his experiences in the cedar forest. Rather than being overwhelmed by the goddess's beauty and the magnificence of her promises, he found himself analyzing her offer with the careful attention of a ruler who had learned to consider the long-term consequences of his decisions. The memory of Baba's final pleas had sensitized him to the dangers of actions that might appear beneficial in the immediate term, but could create unforeseen problems in the future. The king's rejection of Ishtar's advances was not delivered with the diplomatic evasions that might have been expected from a mortal addressing a powerful deity, but with the direct honesty that had characterized his relationship with Enkidu. He acknowledged the goddess's beauty and the attractiveness of her offers, but proceeded to catalogue the fate of her previous lovers with a precision that demonstrated his thorough knowledge of divine mythology and his understanding of the patterns that governed Ishtar's romantic relationships. Gilgamesh's recitation of Ishtar's romantic history began with Tammuz, the shepherd god, who had been her most famous consort and whose fate had become a cautionary tale throughout the ancient Near East. The king described how the goddess's initial passion for Tammuz had led to a period of intense happiness and mutual devotion, but how her affections had eventually cooled and transformed into the cruel indifference that characterized her treatment of discarded lovers. Tammuz's condemnation to spend half of each year in the underworld was not the result of external forces, but of Ishtar's own decision to sacrifice him to preserve her own divine status. The catalogue continued with the bird-catcher who had served Ishtar faithfully until his usefulness ended, at which point the goddess had transformed him into a mole condemned to live in perpetual darkness beneath the earth. The gardener who attended her sacred groves had been changed into a frog when his devotion began to bore her, while the lion, who had been her companion in hunting expeditions, had been trapped in pitfalls of her own devising when his strength began to rival her own. Each example demonstrated the same pattern of initial favor followed by inevitable abandonment and cruel punishment. The shepherd who had provided Ishtar with the finest offerings from his flocks had been transformed into a wolf, condemned to be hunted by the very dogs that had once protected his herds. The horse trainer who had bred the swiftest deeds for her chariot had been changed into a stallion and broken to the harness, forced to serve in the very capacity he had once supervised. The examples multiplied as Gilgamesh's memory drew upon the extensive mythological knowledge that formed part of every Mesopotamian king's education, each story reinforcing the pattern of divine fickleness and mortal suffering that characterized the goddess's romantic relationships. The psychological insight that Gilgamesh demonstrated in his analysis of Ishtar's behavior revealed the depth of understanding he'd gained through his friendship with Enkidu and his experiences as a reformed ruler. It recognized that the goddess's pattern of behavior stemmed not from malice, but from the fundamental incompatibility between divine nature and mortal needs. Her immortal existence made it impossible for her to sustain the kind of long-term commitment that meaningful relationships required, while her unlimited power removed the constraints that forced mortals to consider the consequences of their actions. The king's rejection was delivered with the respectful but firm tone of a ruler who had learned to balance diplomatic necessity with personal integrity. He acknowledged Ishtar's divine status and expressed gratitude for her interest, but made clear that he understood the inevitable consequences of accepting her proposition. His analysis demonstrated not only his intelligence, but his moral growth, as he chose to forego immediate pleasure and advancement in favor of preserving his autonomy and protecting himself from the fate that had befallen the goddess's previous lovers. The goddess's reaction to Gilgamesh's rejection was immediate and volcanic, as her divine pride struggled to process the unprecedented experience of being refused by a mortal. Her beauty transformed into terrifying majesty as her true nature revealed itself. Eyes that blazed like furnaces and a voice that carried the power of storms and earthquakes. The air around her crackled with supernatural energy that made the very stones of the palace tremble, while her presence seemed to expand until it filled the entire throne room with an aura of barely contained cosmic force. Ishtar's rage was not merely personal, but cosmic in scope, as Gilgamesh's rejection represented a challenge to the divine order that governed the relationship between gods and mortals. Throughout the history of Mesopotamian civilization, no human had ever refused the advances of a major deity, and the precedent that Gilgamesh was setting threatened to undermine the fundamental assumptions about divine authority and mortal subservience that maintained the stability of the cosmic hierarchy. The goddess's fury was therefore both a personal response to wounded pride and a defensive reaction to protect the established order. The immediate target of Ishtar's wrath was not Gilgamesh himself, as direct action against him would have required justification that even her divine status could not provide without risking conflict with other gods who might view such punishment as excessive. Instead, she directed her fury toward her father Anu, the supreme god of the Mesopotamian pantheon, demanding that he provide her with the means to punish Gilgamesh, indirectly through the destruction of his city and people. Her appeal to Anu represented an escalation of the conflict that would test the stability of the divine hierarchy. Itself, the goddess's journey to the celestial realm where Anu held court was marked by supernatural phenomena that announced her approach to every god and spirit in the divine hierarchy. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend around her passage, with stars shifting in their courses and cosmic winds carrying the scent of her rage across infinite distances. Her arrival at Anu's palace created tremors that shook the foundations of heaven itself, while her demands for justice echoed through the celestial halls with a force that compelled attention from every divine being within the cosmic order. Ishtar's petition to her father combined personal grievance with theological argument, as she portrayed Gilgamesh's rejection not merely as an insult to her dignity, but as a fundamental challenge to divine authority that required immediate and decisive response. She argued that allowing a mortal to refuse a goddess's advances without consequence would encourage similar acts of defiance throughout the human world, ultimately undermining the respect and reverence that maintain the proper relationship between the divine and mortal realms. Her demand for the bowl of heaven represented not merely a request for a weapon of destruction, but an appeal for the restoration of cosmic order through the demonstration of divine power. The bowl of heaven that Anu reluctantly released from the celestial realm was a creature of such devastating power that its very existence threatened the stability of the natural order. When the massive beast materialized in the fields outside Uruk, its hooves struck the earth with such force that cracks appeared in the ground for miles in every direction, while its breath created scorching winds that withered crops and dried up irrigation channels. The bull's hide gleamed like polished bronze, impervious to conventional weapons, while its eyes burned with the same divine fire that had once blazed in Humbaba's gaze. Its horns, each longer then a man's body could gore through the strongest fortifications as easily as a knife-piercing cloth. The destruction that followed the bull's arrival was systematic and merciless. The creatures rampaged through Uruks, agricultural districts, destroyed years of careful cultivation in a matter of hours, trampling grain fields and demolishing the complex irrigation systems that had sustained the city's population for generations. The economic foundation of Gilgamesh's kingdom crumbled under the beast's assault as storage facilities were crushed and trade routes became impassable due to the fissures that opened in the earth wherever the bull's hooves touched the ground. The carefully maintained balance between urban civilization and agricultural production that had made prosperous was shattered by divine wrath given physical form. The human cost of the bull's assault was staggering as hundreds of citizens died in the initial attack and thousands more found themselves homeless and destitute. The creature's supernatural strength allowed it to demolish entire city blocks with single blows, while its fiery breath created infernos that consumed everything in their path. The screams of the dying and the crash of collapsing buildings created a cacophony of destruction that could be heard for miles, while the smoke from burning structures darkened the sky and blocked out the sun's light. The pride and prosperity that had characterized Uruk under Gilgamesh's reformed rule were replaced by terror and desperation as the city's inhabitants fled before the divine punishment that had been unleashed upon them. The battle that Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought against the Bull of Heaven required every skill and technique they had developed during their partnership as they faced an opponent whose power exceeded even Humbaba's formidable capabilities. The creature's size made conventional combat tactics ineffective, while its supernatural nature rendered many of their weapons useless against its bronze-like hide. The warriors were forced to rely on speed and coordination, using their knowledge of each other's fighting styles to create opportunities for attack while avoiding the bull's devastating charges and the scorching heat of its breath. The turning point in the battle came when Enkidu managed to grasp the bull's massive horns, using his superhuman strength to wrestle the creature to a standstill, while Gilgamesh delivered the killing blow with his great sword. The beast's death throes were accompanied by earthquakes and lightning strikes that announced to the divine realm that their instrument of punishment had been defeated by mortal hands. The bull's body dissolved into golden dust that scattered on the wind, leaving behind only the memory of destruction and the knowledge that even divine wrath could be overcome by courage and friendship working in perfect harmony. However, the victory over the Bull of Heaven proved to be Pyrrhic as the gods' council convened in the celestial realm to address the unprecedented defiance that Gilgamesh and Enkidu had demonstrated. The divine assembly presided over by Anu, and including all the major deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon, faced a crisis that threatened the fundamental order of their cosmic hierarchy. Two mortals had now killed both Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, and the Bull of Heaven, Ishtar's instrument of divine justice. These represented not merely individual crimes, but a pattern of behavior that challenged the very foundations of divine authority over the mortal world. The debate that unfolded in the divine council revealed the complexity of the gods' relationship with exceptional mortals and the difficulty of maintaining cosmic order when faced with beings whose capabilities approach divine levels. Enlil, the god of wind and storms, argued forcefully that both heroes deserve death for their repeated violations of divine will, emphasizing that allowing such defiance to go unpunished would encourage similar acts of rebellion throughout the human world. His position reflected the traditional view that mortals must remain subordinate to divine authority, regardless of their individual achievements or capabilities. Shamash, the sun god who had blessed the hero's expedition to the cedar forest, offered a more nuanced perspective that acknowledged the moral complexity of the situation. He pointed out that Gilgamesh and Enkidu had acted with courage and honor in their confrontations with supernatural enemies, and that their victories had been achieved through legitimate means rather than trickery or divine assistance. The sun god's argument emphasized that punishing heroes for defending their city and people would undermine the very values that the gods claimed to represent, creating a contradiction that could damage divine credibility among mortal worshippers. The goddess, who had created Enkidu in response to the prayers of Uruk's oppressed citizens, found herself in the difficult position of defending her creation while acknowledging the validity of her fellow deities' concerns. Her argument focused on the original purpose of Enkidu's existence, emphasizing that he'd been designed to moderate Gilgamesh's behavior and transform him from a tyrant into a just ruler. The wild man's success in achieving this goal had benefited not only the people of Uruk, but the cosmic order itself, as it had restored proper balance between royal power and divine authority. However, she also acknowledged that Enkidu's continued existence posed potential risks if his influence encouraged further acts of defiance against divine will. The compromise that emerged from the divine council's deliberations reflected the gods' recognition that some punishment was necessary to maintain cosmic order while avoiding the complete destruction of two heroes whose achievements had earned them a measure of divine respect. The decision that one of the two friends must die was presented as a balanced solution that would demonstrate divine authority while preserving the life of the survivor as a testament to the god's capacity for mercy. The choice of Enkidu as the victim was influenced by his status as a created being rather than a naturally born human, making his death less disruptive to the established order of mortal society. The divine illness that began to consume Enkidu manifested initially as a series of disturbing dreams that invaded his sleep with increasing frequency and intensity. These visions, sent by the gods as harbingers of his approaching doom, revealed aspects of the afterlife that no living mortal had ever been permitted to witness. The dreams began with images of a vast underground realm where the dead existed in perpetual twilight, their forms reduced to shadowy echoes of their former selves. The landscape of this netherworld was barren and desolate, with rivers of bitter water and plains of dust that stretched beyond the horizon under a sky that never changed from its eternal gray. The inhabitants of this underworld realm appeared to Enkidu as figures of profound melancholy, their faces bearing the weight of eternal separation from the living world they had once known. Former kings and commoners alike wandered the dusty plains in identical garments of feathers and clay. Enkidu's dreams revealed the inevitability of his fate. He saw the underworld's guardian, a terrifying being part man and part bird of prey, whose claws could tear through anything and whose eyes pierced all disguise. This vision made clear that no earthly power could prevent his descent into death. His illness struck with divine force, draining his legendary strength and dulling his keen senses. The wild vitality that had defined him ebbed away, leaving him dependent and vulnerable. More painful than the physical decline was the dawning realization of mortality. Born by divine design, Enkidu had believed himself untouchable, yet now he was forced to accept the limits of existence. In his delirium, bitterness consumed him. He cursed the trapper who had led him from the wilderness, wishing ruin on his life. He cursed the temple prostitute who had first drawn him into civilization, condemning her to loneliness and disgrace. His rage reflected regret that leaving the wild had doomed him to divine punishment. But as his mind cleared, his perspective softened. Through divine prompting, He recognized the meaning in his transformation. He had known friendship, fought injustice, and found joy in life. His curses turned to blessings. He wished prosperity for the trapper who had opened his path to a greater world, and honor for the woman who had shown him kindness and guided him into humanity. This shift revealed his acceptance of life's complexity, its mingling of sorrow and joy. Gilgamesh's vigil beside his dying friend shook him to his core. He called healers, priests, and offered endless sacrifices, but nothing availed. Watching Enkidu waste away, his frame withered, his fire dimmed, forced Gilgamesh to face mortality directly. The grief of losing the one person who had given his reign purpose broke him. When Enkidu's final breath came with the dawn, Gilgamesh roared in anguish, his cry echoing through Uruk like a challenge against the gods. For 7 days he refused burial, guarding the body with his sword. But decay soon made denial impossible. Maggots marked the final truth. The funeral was the grandest Uruk had ever seen, with treasures, carvings, and mourners filling the city. Yet no ceremony could heal Gilgamesh. His sorrow became existential. Ruling felt hollow. Ceremonies seemed like empty pageantry. He abandoned his duties, withdrew from court, and let his appearance grow wild. Finally, clad in animal skins, he fled the city, seeking answers beyond civilization's walls. The wilderness became his teacher, as survival itself tested his resolve. Memories of ancient stories haunted him, tales of Utnapishtim, the flood survivor granted immortality. What once had seemed myth now became hope. Perhaps he, too, could escape death's power. His journey carried him into strange lands where natural and divine blurred. Creatures tested his resolve, dreams gave cryptic guidance, and doubt gnawed at him. Was immortality only a lie? Yet grief and fear of death kept him moving forward. At last he reached Mount Mashu, where the scorpion men stood guard. They warned him the path was perilous, but acknowledged his divine blood. Through the tunnel of endless night he stumbled until he emerged into the garden of the gods, where jewel fruit trees and shining beings dwelled. They offered riddled guidance. Too much divine aid would ruin his quest, but wisdom might yet see him through. Beyond lay the waters of death. There he met Urshanabi, the ferryman, who guided him across in a boat woven from light. The crossing stripped away illusions, testing whether he truly sought immortality or merely fled grief. On the far shore lay Utnapishtim's island, frozen since the flood. The ancient survivor greeted him not with triumph but with sorrow. He told his tale, how the gods, angered by humanity's clamor, sent a flood to destroy all. Ye, moved to pity, warned Utnapishtim, who built an ark to preserve life. The storm raged 7 days until silence fell and the waters receded. Birds tested the land. At last, life returned. For his survival, Utnapishtim was granted immortality, but it was exile, cut off forever from mankind. To Gilgamesh, he gave a test: stay awake 7 days. It seemed simple, yet Gilgamesh failed at once, lulled into deep sleep. His failure was marked by loaves of bread baked beside him, each one growing stale with time. The truth was undeniable: mortality cannot be overcome. As a consolation, Utnapishtim revealed a hidden plant, buried in the sea, that could restore youth. Gilgamesh dove and retrieved it, daring to believe he had found hope. But while he bathed, a serpent stole the plant and shed its skin, renewing itself in mockery of his loss. Shattered, Gilgamesh returned to Uruk. His hair was gray, his face lined, yet his eyes now carried wisdom. He looked upon the towering walls of the city and realized, his true legacy was not eternal life, but the achievements and bonds of mortals. Death gives life meaning. Greatness lies not in endless days but in what is built within them. The Epic of Gilgamesh endures because of this lesson. Preserved across millennia, rediscovered in forgotten libraries, it speaks still of grief, friendship, and the search for meaning. Immortality does not come from defying death. It comes from embracing the fleeting beauty of life.